All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. My name is Andy Condoli. I'll be serving as the meeting facilitator tonight. Before we get into welcome remarks, I do want to bring on my colleague Giovanna. She's going to be explaining our Spanish and English language features that we have available for the workshop. So Giovanna, can you come on and tell everyone about these features, please?
Good evening, everyone. My name is Giovanna Wormsbecker, and I'll be your Spanish interpreter. In order to provide language access, this meeting will have simultaneous interpretation from English to Spanish. Please note that the translation globe will not appear until I've read through all language instructions. If you're bilingual, you do not have to click anything. If you're not bilingual, you will have to select the language that you speak in order to hear the interpretation. If you're on a laptop or a desktop, you will see a globe at the bottom right of your screen. Please click on the globe icon that says interpretation and select English. If you're on an iPad or a similar device, locate the three-dot menu on the upper right and select language interpretation, then select English. When it's your turn to speak, please remember to be loud and clear and speak at a moderate pace, as the interpreter will be interpreting simultaneously into the other language. Buenas noches a todos. Me llamo Giovanna Wormsbecker y voy a ser su intérprete en español durante esta reunión. Esta reunión contará con una interpretación simultánea bidireccional de inglés al español. El globo de traducción no va a aparecer hasta que se haya leído todas las instrucciones en los dos idiomas. Si usted no es bilingüe, no tiene que presionar nada. Si usted no es bilingüe, tendrá que elegir su idioma para escuchar la interpretación. Si está utilizando una computadora, verá un icono en la parte inferior de la pantalla, a la derecha en forma de globo que dice interpretación. Haga clic ahí y seleccione español. Si está utilizando un iPad o su teléfono, localice el menú de 3 puntos que aparece arriba a la derecha, haga clic en interpretación de idiomas y elija español. Cuando sea su turno de hablar, por favor recuerde hacerlo con voz fuerte y clara y a un paso moderado, ya que la intérprete estará interpretando simultáneamente al otro idioma. Thank you, Andy, back to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Giovanna. So you should now be able to see that globe on your Zoom control. So please do select the English that works, excuse me, the language that works best for you now. But I want to explain a couple other features that we'll be using tonight as part of the meeting format. First of all, when we move into the public comment period, which will be the bulk of our time tonight, we have the chat feature. The Zoom chat feature is a really helpful tool, I think, for all of us, for you to submit just your direct direct comments that you'd like to offer to the project team. But if you do have specific questions, you can type them in there. We will track them from there, and our team will respond this evening with the best information they have. So we wanted to highlight that for you. But if you'd also like to speak over audio to everyone using your microphone, you can also use the raise hand feature, and that will help us to understand that you'd like to do so. So I believe if anyone is dialing in just on a phone line, I believe the number is you would indicate *6, and that'll indicate to us that you'd like to speak or provide a comment or ask a question. So then for those of you who might be on a smartphone, and you happen to see this on screen, those settings, if you click the more button on many of the Zoom interface on a smartphone, the 3-dot more button should open up to you the chat and the raise hand features. So there you go. Thank you for working to hear about those features. But now I wanted to move more into the expansive welcoming remarks. So again, my name is Andy Pindoli. I'm part of the project team that the County of San Diego Land Use and Environment Group has formed to help move forward in developing the regional decarbonization framework. And so just again, want to thank you all for being here tonight. We want to take a minute to just set the stage for where we are today with the regional decarbonization framework and how you can continue to help shape the end product and what the next steps are going to be. This project has benefited from detailed technical analysis, months of open community dialogue and recommendations from different interests. And since the County Board of Supervisors directed the creation of this framework in January 2021, with the goal to reach net zero carbon as a region by mid-century, we've explored how any collective recommendations for moving forward will affect employment. And we've looked at where the region's cities are with their climate action plans and what more needs to be done to achieve the visionary goal of decarbonizing an entire region. So what do we do with all this information that we've been generating and collecting? Now we're ready to channel all that knowledge into actionable steps. The end goal is to have a playbook or a guide that local governments in our region can reference as they plan their decarbonization efforts. And to craft that playbook, we need your continued participation in the areas that interest you the most. So maybe your world is transportation. We need you to participate in the development of actionable steps for that subject matter. But that cuts across all the sectors we're studying as part of this effort. It's also important to recognize that local governments are not all starting from the same place. Some may be investing differently in their sustainable actions. There may be different levels of political interest or leadership, expertise, funding, but the hope is to arrive at the same place, meaningful collective action to reduce carbon emissions that are compromising the region's quality of life. So now with that, before I introduce our presenters here, I do want to let you know, again, we'll go through a presentation about 20 minutes or so, give or take. We're going to have our presenters go all the way through all of those slides. And then at the end of their presentation, we're going to open up to all of you to hear your thoughts and reactions and ideas based on the information shared tonight. We have some questions for you to help shape the discussion. We'd love to have your responses too. So we'll look forward to sharing those with you after we get through the presentation. So first of all, I'm going to introduce Mirza Baksamusa with the County of San Diego, and he's going to begin the presentation, and then he'll be introducing Rebecca a little further down the line. So,
thank you, Andy. So as Andy mentioned, my name is Murtaza Baksamusa, and with me is Rebecca Pell. We lead the team at the county that is moving forward with this board-initiated project to the finish line. I'm glad Andy mentioned the word collaborative, because that is really the heart of this framework. We know that none of us can address the climate emergency on our own. We stand at a critical juncture in this project where we are transitioning from study to action. Your involvement will be critical in the shaping of actionable steps that will help us get to zero carbon emissions in our region. So let's do a quick review of the principles that guide our work, the kind of emissions we are focused on, and the key timeframes. There are three principles that guided this work from the start. We are data-driven to objectively gauge where we are and where we want to be. The work is guided by input from the public, including business groups, labor unions, environmental advocates, Native American tribes, and communities across the region. And finally, a strong collaboration helps us understand how best to work with public agencies, cities, regional authorities, and tribal governments. Collaboration can also attract state and federal resources for climate mitigation, adaptation, and resiliency. Okay, now that we know how we're approaching this work, what is it that we're working to achieve? I have this chart here to help us visualize the types of emissions we are trying to reduce throughout the region. These are all the sources of pollution of planet heating gases produced in this region. The largest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions are on-road transportation, both light and heavy-duty vehicles, electricity generation, the use of natural gas in buildings. These four emissions categories account for 80% of regional emissions. Now, keep in mind, though, there may be a lot more emissions that are produced outside the region in the supply of materials, such as avocados that could be grown in Mexico that gets transported here. Our border traffic is a significant contributor to greenhouse gases, and binational effort will be needed to fully address that source. To meaningfully achieve the outcomes with these projects, we have an integrated approach. It began with a technical report on your left, followed by a workforce development study in the center, both of which are now complete and will be available next week. The technical report was led by UC San Diego to scientifically identify the best sectors to focus on, and USD to assess the region's current efforts and identify what is missing to reach that goal. We also engaged an independent consultant to study the impact of any future changes on the workforce, as well as opportunities for growth in high quality jobs. We are now beginning the process with the third component on your right, the implementation playbook that will help us guide the implementation of regional decarbonization activities. Previously referred to as the Implementation Pathways Report, this playbook will be an accessible resource that can be used widely by different players, including local cities. For example, we are developing social equity guidance that can be plugged into by cities in their climate action plans. Here is our timeline. The next slide. The yellow highlight shows where we are in the process. The topic-specific working groups will help shape the first draft of the playbook. We will also have the benefit of a new report on sustainable agriculture considerations from UC San Diego, which will help inform the second draft. With this draft in hand, we will then be able to convene local governments to have a more tangible discussion on how we can collectively reach our regional goals. On August 31st, next month, we will be providing an update to the Board of Supervisors that includes the next steps for the implementation playbook. During this meeting, county staff will also present several projects that will show how the county is leading by example with our own facilities and initiatives in the unincorporated area in support of the framework. These include net zero energy efforts, tree planting, and a carbon farming pilot project. We intend to seek board adoption of this entire framework in the spring of 2023. Throughout this time until spring, we will be using a variety of methods to engage the community and stakeholder groups in the process to develop this implementation playbook. There are many ways we are engaging the public moving forward. This will include an advisory technical working group comprised of people recommended by the board, regional agencies, and project team. A social equity working group intended to provide a voice for underserved communities on climate-related investments. Public workshops which will occur during key milestones for the project. Working groups by emission sector, which will consist of participants interested in shaping the implementation activities. These will occur over fall, and I will discuss them a little bit later. And regional convenings that are keystone events organized within each supervisory district with community outreach and engagement led by community-based organizations. The initial series of convenings would occur in early next year. We appreciate all your feedback throughout this process. This is going to be, the technical report is going to be the third and final version. The range of ideas, concerns, and advice that we received during the public comment period over the two prior drafts, and from those who participated in our community meetings and workshops, have been vetted and incorporated as much as was feasible into the final chapters. In the next couple of slides, I'll provide samples of comments and feedback we received and how chapter authors, which ranged over almost 36 of them, incorporated them into the final report. For example, in buildings, some workshops participants expressed concerns about electrification costs, especially for low-income households and residential building in the residential building and for large buildings in the commercial building context. The authors included information on financing options that are currently available and incentives for electrification. Stakeholders also asked about public buildings and how they were categorized. That information was also incorporated into the analysis. Next, on electricity, stakeholders were interested in just a sample of some of the feedback we received. There'll be much more detailed analysis and presentation when we have the final report come out next week. The renewable energy siting scenarios, for example, there were questions about transmission costs and the methodology for computation of that cost. The authors included detailed explanations of these transmission costs. There were several suggestions on site selection for renewable energy projects, particularly to protect the backcountry's rural unincorporated communities and habitats from land use change. The authors added additional scenarios that will prioritize infill and rooftop solar, as well as include the impact of multiple species conservation program. Next, on land use and natural climate solutions, we received suggestions on processing facilities for organic materials, and from the farming community, the importance of keeping our farms solvent. The authors updated the climate farming section to better reflect local ecological and economic conditions. There were also a considerable amount of information provided to us, for example, on implementation of Senate Bill 1383 on organic materials, promoting end use of end product of facilities, for example, compost, mulch, and renewable energy, and edible food waste from going to waste, as well as procuring of energy from these products. We incorporated this into this chapter. Next, on transportation. Some suggested we look for opportunities for transfer of development rights. The authors looked for case studies and have incorporated cases where there was a transaction across jurisdiction of land use rights and entitlements. Some stakeholders expressed that suggestions on vehicle miles traveled reductions could be improved through public transit or active transportation. The authors included state and local context on how jurisdictions are valuing VMT reductions and added the importance of a multi-pronged approach in both addressing driving as well as vehicles. Next, on the local policy opportunities chapter, this is the one by USD EPIC that assessed where we are now and what it will take to reach the goal in climate action plans. We received suggestions on updates that were going through the process. The authors have included City of San Diego's proposed new climate action plan and recognized Coronado's CAP adoption. We also need to recognize that the draft scoping plan by the California Air Resources Board, or CARB, will significantly impact all sectors of the decarbonization framework. So with that analysis, with the technical framework that is with us, we're now proceeding onto the implementation playbook design. As Andy mentioned, we're using this repository whilst that analysis is still going on into figuring out how do we get there, what are the next steps. So in terms of the concept for what it is that the playbook could be, it builds off of that local policy opportunity analysis chapter by USD. That is at a starting point. And then it'll propose a set of ways to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, for example, in terms of strategies, such as facilities owned and operated by local governments. It will also be sorted by decarbonization topic, such as buildings, electricity, land use, natural climate solutions, transportation, as well as, very importantly, the type of authority, such as local jurisdictions, either individually or collectively. And finally, I should also note that this is a playbook, not a plan. It would not have quantitative targets and milestones at this time to be achieved, but it is a resource for all public and private organizations, businesses, communities to use in an accessible format to tailor strategies to use in the sectors that they choose. So the next few slides provide an idea of what could be in the implementation playbook as shaped by each working group in the fall of this year, with the goal of having the draft of that implementation playbook done by the end of this year. So let me start with buildings. If you're interested in buildings, our technical report found that 80% of these buildings that exist in the region today, 80% of the regions that exist in 2050 would already have been built. For example, particularly addressing existing building electrification was a strategy recommended by the consultants. The group could look around at what different codes are and assess these building codes in order to have the same standards for water and heating systems. Could also look at various criteria for how much it would cost, the greenhouse gas impact and reduction that could be achieved, as well as the timeline to help implement these goals. Next, electricity. One question that has come up in the stakeholder meetings and workshops, and this is an example, once again, how do we equitably roll out rooftop and infill solar in our region? Throughout our outreach and technical findings, we found that the region will need large investments in renewable energy to meet future demand and state mandated emissions goals. This group would start with identifying the needs, understanding population demographics, types of buildings in our region that are feasible for rooftop solar to scale up to meet the needs of the region, as well as strategize on the cost and payment while applying an equity lens. Once again, the criteria could be impact, equity, cost. Next, our land use and natural climate solutions sector had a lot of focus on how these strategies intersect with people and the economy. One example is tree canopy, which focused both on urban and suburban areas. This working group could focus on identifying areas that could, across jurisdictions, that could have more trees and green space, understand the cooling effects and resiliency benefits from extreme heat. This would also help address historic inequities of green space and parks in our region. Also, this group could determine strategies also best for rural areas such as preservation of land and restoration with native plants. Once again, the criteria could include impact in terms of greenhouse gases, equity, and cost. Next, for transportation, on-road transportation of vehicles with internal combustion engines emits the most greenhouse gases in the region. This group could help brainstorm and craft what incentives could be in place to transition over to a cleaner vehicle. Now, any type of vehicle on the road, cars, buses, trucks. They could also look at cross-border traffic, particularly trucks coming in from outside the region. Working groups would develop strategies and also discuss a number of criteria. Once again, things like greenhouse gas impact, cost, potential funding sources, and equity. Now, we are in this journey at the beginning stages. This playbook is our first step. And those examples I provided are only a sample of what the working groups would help shape. This diagram shows the flow of work from the technical report on the top left corner to the regional climate action plan at the bottom right corner, which is possible one of the next steps in our decarbonization effort. The implementation playbook is the bridge between the analysis and the implementation. The possible next steps listed on the right of your screen could be regional initiatives that we can begin right away, such as assisting other cities in CAP development, local ordinances around electrification, regional tree study, evaluation of carbon farming techniques. Second in that list is regional greenhouse gas analysis with specific timelines for measures in each of the pathways. And the third in that list is regional climate action plan. also an option on the table, such as those pursued in Humboldt and Sonoma counties. These would be voluntary efforts among local jurisdictions. The advantage of this is that we would have quantified goals with timelines and measures for our collective progress. With this, I will turn it over to Rebecca.
Good evening, everyone. As shared earlier with the stakeholder feedback, the RDF focuses on the 4 decarbonization sectors that you see on the screen: buildings, electricity, land use and natural climate solutions, and transportation. Based on the board direction we received earlier this year and from stakeholder feedback, we've added a 5th sector: food systems and the circular economy. So this image is from the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, and even though there is a lot to look at and a lot to digest, what we want to highlight is the cyclical notion of the diagram and continuous flow of materials and process to represent a circular economy, which is defined by reducing material use, redesigning materials to be less resource intensive, and recapturing so-called waste as a resource to make new materials and products. Creating a circular economy is included in the county's sustainability vision and goals, which was adopted by our board in March of this year. This new sector is also focused on food systems, which considers all aspects of food, including sustainable agricultural practices, infrastructure, and inputs such as land and water that are utilized to produce food, as well as the consumption, distribution, and ultimate disposal of food. We're excited about this new sector in the regional decarbonization framework because it captures emissions broadly, that of the 4 pathways analyzed in the technical report. It builds on the research that has gone into San Diego County Food Vision 2030 and the Land Use and Natural Climate Solutions chapter of the technical report, as well as the workforce development study, which was that second component. There are a number of great efforts already underway in our region to support the food system and circular economy that we look forward to working with stakeholders on and highlighting in the implementation playbook that will be, as Murtaza mentioned, a resource for organizations and local governments. So I'll hand it back to you, Murtaza.
Thank you, Rebecca. There is a renewed interest at a federal level in investing in the circular economy concept, as well as in energy production. So this is an interesting chapter in terms of intersection between the different pathways. Now, what we're asking you to do is engage and join us, beginning with our working groups. We will be going through these working groups starting in August. On August, we'll be opening up an invitation, a web page, so that folks that are interested can express which sectors that they would like to participate in. We'll be starting the working groups in September and going through November in order to develop the draft implementation playbook. So in terms of the sectors, that Rebecca described, many of you have provided feedback and comments and shared your thoughts in the past. We would like you to help shape this playbook. There are 3 ways you can get involved. The first, which, as I mentioned, is by participating in the working groups. The second is by joining us in our public workshops and the regional convenings in early 2023, which you will be invited to attend. And third, by providing your ideas and suggestions for implementation, such as convening industry-specific problem-solving tables to move ideas into action. On a closing note, there's a lot of potential for us to bring climate-related investments and good quality jobs to our communities if you're looking ahead on regional climate action. Our role as stewards of public resources across the region is to convene and provide the forum for smart, creative, and collaborative thinking that can benefit us all. Together, a greener future is bright. We anticipate everything you saw today going to be the board on August 31st, as well as actions that have been proposed by our departments to align with the regional decarbonization framework. Thank you for your time. We are here to answer your questions.
All right, Mirza, thank you very much. Rebecca, thank you. And thank you all for your patience and working through the slides. And we want to dedicate the rest of our time to hear from you all. We have some questions we'd like to pose to you. And we're already getting questions from some of you in the chat and raising your hand. And so again, the chat is really valuable and helpful for all of us. I think it's a good way for us to record input from all of you, but also just to track. And we've got some already. But again, the raise hand feature is helpful as well. And I see it's already in use, which is great. If you'd like to speak over the audio, we'll be able to unmute you so that you can do so. And again, for those of you who might be on a smartphone, I just want to make sure you know if you touch the more button, you should be able to get access to chat and to raise your hand. And again, if anyone is on a phone line only, you should be able to indicate to us that you'd like to speak using *9. I may have said *6 earlier. *9 is the way to do that. So what I'd like to do, I want to pose a first question to all of you, but we will first come to some questions that came into the chat. But for the rest of you, we'd love to, for all of you, we'd love to get your thoughts about the types of criteria that might be part of the implementation playbook. And you heard Mirza speaking to some of those. This could be cost, level of impact on greenhouse gas emissions, equity and impact in environmental justice communities, funding availability that exists today or that we see as potential, who can lead and or support efforts. So those are sorts of criteria that are starting to emerge that the project team thinks may be most helpful to build a playbook. But as you're starting to form some responses to that, because we're looking forward to that, I do want to reflect on some questions that came in already. Craig, I see your hand up. So we'll come to you in a minute over the audio. Craig, you were asking about how to join a working group. The county will be posting information about how to sign up for those working groups just in the next couple of weeks. So I want to encourage you to stay in touch with the RDF website. And again, we'll post that link here in a little while. They'll be sending out an e-blast when that's available as an opportunity. So look forward to receiving that information about identifying the different groups that are there. And I also want to acknowledge, Teresa, you asked a question. I think for now, we'll take it as a suggested question for the working groups unless Mirza's team has specific reactions about marrying drought restrictions with increased tree canopies, which I think is great. I think it's a good example of what the implementation playbook can identify as specific potential steps, that the jurisdictions and all communities can pursue and look at closely. And Wendy and Michalik, I want to appreciate your comment as well about, where will county government and the other jurisdictions, by the way, again, as a regional effort, where and how will they be investing? And the implementation playbook is absolutely intended to help shape those opportunities, start to identify those potential priorities, where the funding sources can come from, whether that be local, regional, state, federal sources, perhaps, to help invest in these implementation steps that will be built out, many of which have already been developed in this process that the working groups will start to form overall. So I wanted to acknowledge that for all of you. So thank you all for those comments so far. Craig Jones, thanks for waiting here. And again, for the comments you've already posted, you should be able to unmute yourself. What did you want to build on? And hopefully you have some thoughts about criteria in the playbook and what you think would make sense and be important.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. I'm not sure exactly what is meant by criteria as opposed to ideas of implementation tasks or strategies that might be in the implementation playbook. Can you be a little bit more clear on what is meant by criteria?
Yeah, I think the tasks and strategies, feel free to share those, Craig, but I think criteria, the project team is thinking of, no matter what the strategies are, right? Craig, you got a lot of ideas, I know, and everybody here, we've heard a lot. At the end of the day, what are the things that we want to suggest that jurisdictions and community partners think about to implement? So depending any strategy, there should be a clear sense of where the funding could come from. There should be clear indication about who could lead implementing a strategy, who might need to be partners, how much positive impact related to equity, environmental justice communities would a given strategy have. So there's just some examples of criteria the project team thinks, may make sense to inform this playbook, right? So that's what we meant criteria. Does that make sense? And hopefully that benefits everybody too.
Yeah, it does. And I want to note real quickly, my friend Barry Pollard has put in the chat, something very obvious. There should be a large equity component as included in criteria to judge items. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And Barry Pollard, thank you. I saw that as well. And I think Susan, thank you. Susan Wayo, I see your comment about, economics, funding, speed, how quickly was it estimated to implement a given play, as we say in the playbook. There may be some that can be relatively quick. Maybe they're 6 to 12 months to implement something. Some may be much longer term. Maybe they're 5, 10, 20 years out. It'll be important to have these relative criteria and measures there so that collectively, right, as communities, but our jurisdictions have a sense of how much time and effort and investment may be required of specific suggestions. So yeah, more here is just great. Ranking approaches in terms of effectiveness, I see noted here. Lead time, cost, I see noted from some of you, from Jeff. Thank you very much for that. Rebecca, the financial support related to transportation and energy use changes, particularly for communities in need, lower socioeconomic status communities, resource considerations, collateral damage, environmental people, available technology from Kendall. Thank you. Demographics of the region, that every play, if you will, or suggested strategy is reflective and attentive to the demographics, who can potentially benefit most. So very good. So I see these are fantastic. Thank you all for bringing these into the chat. Let's see, I see Sonia Robinson. You should be able to unmute yourself, Sonia. Thank you for being here. What are your thoughts about potential criteria that whatever
yeah, so my question was really not specifically on a criteria. So if that's our focus now, I can resume my question a little later. It was more or less just in response of the presentation you guys provided.
Sure, go ahead, please.
Okay, yeah. I want to say thank you. I thought you guys did a really good job in providing, everything that led up to this point to include public input to this process for each area. And so I was just kind of curious because we've had our conversations about the input and if the input's going to be included. So I do have a question on when we're looking at the next possible step, when you took like the RDF's technical report, the local policy analysis into this implementation playbook that we have now, and then we received feedback from land use, from buildings, from electricity and transportation, right? So more, I'm going to focus on the electricity and renewable aspect. Where will those assumptions be? Like you guys did a great job, I think, in capturing that. You said, okay, there was assumptions on transmission costs. There was some findings with specific input related to the rooftop solar. And then more specifically, when it comes to the equity lens, I'm wondering, is the energy burden going to be also included on that? But before I get to that third question, I'm sorry, it's a pretty packed question here, is that the assumptions that you provided on the transmission costs, as well as the public input related to examples with rooftop solar and infills being included, how, and any other feedback that you guys presented, which I thought you did a great job in capturing that feedback and presenting it back to us, how is that, will it be part of that implementation playbook, or how will it be part of that implementation playbook?
Thank you, Sonia. Great question. And just to make sure I'm hearing you correctly, please jump in if I mischaracterize this. So all this work we've done to date, and Sonia, you in particular, and others who are here tonight, have been part of many meetings with a lot of input, technical input, and reflecting on the technical data the team has generated. So where does all of that, what do we do with all of that? Will the working group use it? And the short answer is, and I'd like Murtaza to come in and speak to this more, Rebecca. The short answer is absolutely. All that information, the technical reporting information, and your input as stakeholders in the community will be brought to the working groups. That will be informing their work very much so. So they're going to have a wealth of information from the process we've had so far. That's going to help inform what they may recommend to build the playbook. Because again, to be clear, everybody, we do not have a playbook yet.
Okay.
Murtaza, as you acknowledged, Murtaza mentioned some examples of some potential strategies or tactics that may be in the playbook based on what we've heard so far, right? But these are some initial ideas and examples that the working groups are very much going to get their hands working on and thoroughly working through all the data. So let me ask Murtaza briefly. Murtaza, did I do justice there to hopefully answer Sonia's question? Do you want to add to that? Or?
Yes. Thank you, Sonia, for incredible amount of work you put into this in helping us shape our thinking and our report. Also kind of having us think, because this is up till now, what we've been doing is studying. Now the studies will go on, but now we have to understand what the assumptions were whilst we're making these like informed trade-offs on between cost and other criteria. So this is an important question as to what is the methodology on how did we arrive at what was called the levelized cost of energy, of comparing between energy per unit from different sources of energy. In the analysis, was made very clear in terms of what is the infrastructure cost assumptions, particularly the physical infrastructure, the grid costs, and the transmission costs. These are critical assumptions. And from there on, there's going to be, if you look at more urban areas, the cost of distribution, the cost of storage, we'll have to look at that as part of the electricity sector, electricity workshop, working group. So what I would suggest is that those of you that are interested in that energy sector, and I broadly described it, whether it be battery storage type of renewable energy, or either generation, transmission, storage, or it could just be related to, say, the siting and equity consideration of different types of renewable energy, including urban infill solar. That would be one of the key sectors that we will be focusing on.
Okay. So
Thank you.
Go ahead, Sonia.
I just have one other question.
Sure.
When you also, in your scenario, Murtaza, thank you for that. You did great. Is you mentioned a quantity on MSCP land, and I apologize that I'm not familiar with that acronym. So in your scenario, you put prioritize infill and rooftop solar and quantify.
Correct. So it's a way, it is a way of factoring in conservation land. MSCP is multiple species conservation program. There's a South County MSCP, and then there's one North County in process. So there is MSCP land, and then there's some lands that are in process. So this was just a kind of a placeholder, if you will, to identify areas that were have conservation value.
And thank you, Mirza, for answering that. So Sonia, in a few minutes, you'll see in the chat, the project team will include one or two links to websites back to the county that explains the MSCP, the multiple species conservation plans, in more detail. So I'm sure there are others here, not just you, Sonia, who would be interested in reading that. So keep an eye out. You'll see, all of you, if you will, keep an eye out in the chat. In a couple minutes, you'll see some posts. I'll ask maybe Rebecca or Elise, maybe you can take the lead on putting links to those sites. So thank you very much, Sonia, for those questions. And again, I want to acknowledge everybody who's provided comments in the chat. I'm going to bring up another question here, but I do want to just briefly acknowledge what's been coming in the chat. And more comments from Craig about potential criteria. Thank you very much. Barry noting that the data really needs to be rooted in neighborhoods, talk locally, but also regionally as well, because a given strategy in the playbook may or may not be more relevant to a different neighborhood type in our region, of urban versus suburban versus rural. So Toshi, thank you very much. More about ease of implementation as a criteria to track return on investment, speed of GHG reduction, and of course the equity lens. And Susan, I think we spoke to the transmission cost. The technical report has that information in detail. And let's see, Adrian Mirza, can you come back and forgive me if you didn't already answer this, but Adrian Fusek is asking, will the playbook, why will the playbook exclude quantitative targets, milestones, and timelines? Is that because this is not prescriptive to each jurisdiction, Mirza, but is more of kind of a menu of options that each jurisdiction can call from? Is that right?
Yes, thank you, Andy, and thank you, Adrian. That's a very good question. It's important to remember that the playbook is tying together the study and the implementation. It's not the plan. The plan has to have that. The plan would be having the targets, the emissions targets, and timelines. Nonetheless, what we're setting up is, if you will, the framework by which, if you will, the menu of options from which we can draw, if you will, the pre-planning stage, the kind of activities that could be analyzed, measures for a potential emissions reduction, regional goals. So therefore, with the timelines and the measures, so where we all can then hold ourselves accountable, even if it's voluntarily, in terms of what timelines and measures we're going to take.
Very good. Thank you very much for that. So good. And so hopefully we encourage you all, if you have more thoughts about criteria, feel free to continue bringing those forward in the chat. We'd love to hear those. But hopefully you see on screen here, I've introduced another question. You heard the presentation where Rebecca spoke about the introduction of the food system sector as a fifth component, fifth sector, if you will, within this framework for the RDF. And so we wanted to just get your thoughts about, how you see the addition of that sector more intentionally in the decarbonization framework. How can that strengthen our efforts, in our region overall? Maybe there's local level, regional, city, neighborhood level. What are your thoughts as to the value? What new opportunities do you see bringing this forward into our discussion around decarbonization? So we welcome any and all thoughts as we start to develop that sector a little bit more specifically. So very good. And otherwise, we're happy to also answer any additional questions that you may have. So just also, again, a quick brief check-in on process here for tonight. We're scheduled to go as late as 8 p.m. if needed, depending upon the level of questions and comments that you have. But we certainly won't be shy to, we've heard from everybody and we've gotten all your questions answered and heard all your comments. We'll be happy to wrap up earlier tonight to get everybody back to their evening. So just wanted to let you know about that as well. So again, food system sector, would love to hear anyone's thoughts on the food system sector. Adrian, thank you very much in the chat here. Food waste in landfills turns into methane, which traps more heat. So absolutely. So I think I'll dare suggest you mentioned some elements there that might be part of criteria in the playbook around the food sector and what we should be more intentionally focused on overall. And at least the good news is we're not starting from scratch in our region. There has been forward progress, as Rebecca spoke to, with a food vision, essentially, overall, and a lot of data collection. So with better understanding in our system. So good, Barry, thank you for acknowledging that and recognizing that. And metrics being important in the playbook. So thank you. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think as we said, it won't be prescriptive with metrics. Perhaps the playbook can think about that in the longer run, what measures can look like and how we might be able to inform and encourage jurisdictions to be targeted from a quantitative perspective. So healthy soils, thank you very much. And Brian, giving the example of what your farm is doing, thank you for sharing that. Overall, but healthy soils, tracking that can be important. Focus on the playbook and criteria that we think about. Thank you very much. Pesticide use and reduction overall, and as related to petrochemicals. Thank you, John, for those ideas. And again, recognizing our waste and greenhouse gas emissions from landfills, and again, being responsive to current and perhaps future legislation at the state level as it relates, because we know these are continuing to develop. And thank you, Craig, for referencing SB 1383 as an example of what here at the regional local levels, what we may be thinking, how the playbook can support implementation there as well. So very good, excellent. Please do keep those coming. Let me introduce yet another question, if you don't mind. We want to, again, thinking about the process we've been going through, again, want to acknowledge all the work. Many of you have attended many meetings and events and conversations here. And I'll put the graphic back up in a moment about ongoing public participation process. We just really like to hear from you about your thoughts about the process overall. You've had great questions so far about the working groups, and what additional suggestions you have for reaching specific communities. We've of course acknowledged and continue to talk about the importance of equity and reaching underrepresented, underserved communities. So economic justice communities obviously is going to continue to be critical. So I've put up here on screen, just as a refresher, what kind of the path forward can look like in the coming months and years ahead for next steps with the process. And so just wanted up here for reference for you. What are any further thoughts you have about what that engagement can look like? And as we form these working groups, the social equity working group in particular as well, right? What are your thoughts about how these groups can continue to work together, how we're engaging through public workshops, engaging with community-based organizations, as some of you, hopefully you've gathered from Murtaz's comments as he presented this information. CBOs, if I may, they'll be critical to helping to engage with communities that are hard to reach or perhaps do not have the wherewithal or capability to join us on a Zoom meeting like this. How can we again reach those with bear some of the greatest burdens and would benefit perhaps most from implementing the playbook, if you will, in the long run. So good. So want to also thanks. Good. Thank you again. Sandag, you referenced Sandag's model. Certainly don't want to reinvent the wheel. The RDF county staff here have been in close contact with Sandag, for example, along with all the jurisdictions to think about how efforts can be linked. That there's, trying to minimize confusion in the community about where these various efforts are happening and are they connected and linked overall. So by all means, this is intended to be connected. So thank you very much with that. So please do encourage any of you to chime in. What are your thoughts on the public participation process, and what additional, how we can incorporate your ideas into the plan we've laid out so far for the coming months and the next couple of years. So industry organizations, thank you. I'm seeing in the chat here, whether that's on the commercial side, real estate, development community, because we can use those associations to connect with those who are building projects and moving them towards, more of a decarbonization framework overall, bringing them into this process more intentionally. And the good news is they have been at the table so far, these associations and representatives, so we'll continue to do that. Teresa, thank you for that overall and how they can support and be involved in things like implementing SB 1383. So very much so. People who aren't already engaged, Rebecca, thank you for your ideas here. We can, kind of come to them from the angle of what's most important to them. So if transportation mobility is most important, maybe we can come to them from that angle. Food systems, right? Maybe we can come to them to that angle. How does RDF support their passions around some of these areas? Energy, electricity, land use, very much so. Thank you, Rebecca. So we'll definitely think about that, angle of appeal, right, with different interests overall. So so waste haulers, Rubita, thank you. Absolutely, they can be a key stakeholder that we can work to engage and have them involved and thinking about, implementation, enforcement, making sure we have their input and ideas and how they can be part, they and other haulers, waste haulers, for example, can be part of the solution as we move forward in the months and years ahead overall. So absolutely, building that commitment in communities, their buy-in, their understanding of these concepts and how they can play a role so far. So very much. And I do want to say too, I think I can speak on behalf of the county staff who are here to say as hard as they've been working to, cast that net and pull people into meetings like this and more than we have, all of you, everybody else who's here today, your work and help is appreciated in helping to spread the word and sharing this information with communities where you live, your neighborhoods, your communities. If you represent specific interests, by all means, sharing this information, pulling them in and being ambassadors, if you will, to this process are very much appreciated. So want to and thank you, Craig, for some specific examples. The Alliance for Regional Solutions encourage all of you, in addition to the private entities like waste hauler specific associations, please place those in the chat. Our team's collecting that information tonight. So let me come to Murtaza, if you could come on here in a moment. I wanted to ask if you, or maybe another one of your colleagues, can speak to Adrian's question about the other GHG emitting activities in the earlier graphic, the 20%. So Murtaza, if you can answer that question, I'll just give you a second to think about that before I bring you on. But also just want to acknowledge what else I see in the chat here. So again, Teresa's referencing other haulers. Petra, thank you about, broader education in the community. Who, whether that's county government, other government entities, who can be part of that community education effort with things like SB 1383, for example. Multilingual approach, absolutely. It's critical here that we are really targeted when we reach communities in need. Hard to reach communities, we're very intentional and thoughtful about language needs beyond, obviously English and Spanish are primary here in our communities, but many others, as many of you know. So we'll continue to think about that. And Rory, thank you about younger demographics, youth, teenagers, young adults. They will be arguably the ones living with the benefits and burdens in the longest term hopefully from related to decarbonization. So thank you. Please, everybody, please keep those coming. In the meantime, Murtaza, can you speak to the question, what constitutes that 20%? And I'll put the graphic back up here in a moment.
So thank you, because oftentimes we put that intentionally to capture the entirety, that especially that bucket that is often left out of climate discussions, but is important for criteria air pollutants and other impacts of air pollution, such as off-road emissions, emissions from stationary facilities, aviation, things that are oftentimes addressed in other areas, but they're not seen as climate related. So I think these are important intersections. So even though it is gray, it's worth going deeper into and bringing them into the conversation.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for the question related to that. I wanted to acknowledge continuing to great comments and ideas here that you're all bringing forward related to youth, building on that question and idea. Again, reaching through schools, our higher K-12 higher education, inclusive of community college, technical, vocational, the Cal State University of California, so our local entities, to really bring them in to help create solutions. And I'll offer perhaps creating the next leaders, right, in climate change and solutions overall. So absolutely, good. So great. Well,
and Andy, I forgot one sector which is also important here is landfill emissions. These are critical not just from the climate perspective, but also if we are able to capture them in terms of high quality jobs as well. Great.
Excellent. Thank you, Marisa. Good. Well, good. All those questions we've posed to you so far. Yeah, like Teresa, thank you. Yeah, really making it fun, right? In terms of youth engagement, really engaging and just interesting them, drawing in, making it fun. But that we know that when it's fun and interactive, it's meaningful and it has impact in terms of their learning and overall. So want to just again offer up among the questions we've asked you. We're happy to continue answering any questions that you may have. Thanks for those who brought those forward, and any additional comments or questions. So please, I want to encourage you to bring those forward now. So as I said, we have until as late as 8 o'clock. My prediction at this point is we'll probably wrap up sooner. So I want to encourage you now, if you have a lingering question or comment, you're, oh, maybe I will, maybe I won't. I want to go ahead and encourage you to definitely bring it forward now, please. I want to make sure we want to make sure we hear from you and have it as part of our notes tonight, and be able to answer any questions that you may have. So please do include those here. So again, thank you. More great ideas coming in around, really, again, with youth and young adults. Let's not just engage them and educate them. Let's give them some real opportunities to learn in terms of and gain benefit, internship credit. Thank you very much. Great ideas here. More community gardens. Many of you participate in those, and we know the whole kind of benefits around food system and health and nutrition. But again, we can take those as the opportunities also to support, educate around decarbonization, right? Very much so. Thank you. And making those connections about pollinators and mobility, absolutely. So household composting. So question, Mirza, if you can come on, there's a couple questions you see coming into the chat here. How this may tie in with the surf planning, CERF in the region. And I'll preface prior to Mirza coming on to answer that. Anything we can't, I just want to acknowledge, anything we can't answer tonight, we absolutely take as an idea, suggestion, something we need to think about moving forward in the process. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. And Adrian also asking about potential funding sources. If you can talk a little bit about what these funding sources might be. I mean, every different play in the playbook will have different recommendations, but can you talk more about, what you think are probably likely to be funding sources, or at least recommendations for considerations?
So we'll begin with the question that Kendall asked, but it's really, I think I see a few other questions about money in the chat. So broadly speaking, I read that there's almost just by the end of this decade, Department of Energy estimates $23 trillion globally being spent into this clean energy sector. That's trillions. The level of investment that we see coming into some of these is going to change, we think, transform how, in terms of how both our economy, in terms of jobs, as well as businesses are going to look like in 2030 and beyond. So what we're trying to do is position ourselves to be in that competitive edge, but also bring in the values that we want to embed. So we're not just chasing money, but we're building in sustainability, equity, accountability, and empowerment of our communities in those decision-making processes on how that money flows and what decisions are made around implementation. The examples of these are some of the funding applications that are coming out of our region and economic development funding application. The County of San Diego has been trying to catch up in this space in terms of how do we take leadership in economic development. Decarbonization is one of those legs of that stool, of that strategy, by which we will be attracting economic development funds. So the Community Economic Resilience Fund from the state, that application, or it could be transformative climate communities or any other state or federal funding application. If we see that there is alignment in the ways in which our workforce and our local businesses, our communities can benefit, then what we will offer is that we help in that application process, providing that narrative and the support, and then collaborate in implementation. It's also very important that we do the correct kind of outreach. It's so that it's respectful for the communities that we're serving, especially the county is involved. We want to bring the communities in right from the beginning. So that is kind of like the approach here. How do we bring in money is that we can make ourselves more competitive in the right way.
Right. Marissa, I'd like, I want a number of questions to come in. Thank you all for these questions. I've kind of had a little mini flood of them here in just in the last few minutes. Marissa, in a minute, I would ask you, can you speak to two of these questions? One, where is the fund, this effort we're already involved in right now? What's been the level of investment the county has put into this effort for the work done to date and what's coming forward? So that's one question. Then secondly, if you can speak to, what the county may or may not be able to do related to advocating for more state and federal funding down the line. I want to give you a couple minutes to think about that, if you could. And David Pearl, I know you had asked a question about carbon farming pilot project. You should, in a few minutes, we'll see an answer to that in the chat from one of the team members. And then Sonia, I wanted to also acknowledge your comment here as well about the county considering, leadership among BIPOC communities, Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. Thank you for that. And I do want to note that the county is part of continued work in the RDF, in developing the RDF. Community-based organizations will be a key part of how this process is more meaningfully and tangibly connecting with those communities that you're referencing. So I know by all means, the county staff will look forward to yours and others' ideas and input about how those, kind of associations, community-based organizations, and other groups can help make those connections and that reach in meaningful ways. So thank you for that. It's going to be critical to moving the process forward overall. So David Pearl, there's the response from Rebecca about the pilot project. And let's see. And so yeah, Mirza, can you speak to that? I wanted to give you a couple minutes to think about the answers there. Can you speak a little bit more to what the county's invested in this process so far? And then your thoughts about what might, what's expected, if to extent you can speak to it, about the county advocating for more state and federal investment in decarbonization.
So there's two ways to answer. One is like in terms of like contact and staffing resource, and there's another which is an organizational commitment. In terms of what we call the enterprise itself is a $7 billion enterprise. The county of San Diego, I believe, is the 5th largest in the nation. We have to think of ourselves both as producers and consumers, but also market participants in the space. Nonetheless, even with all the resources we have, I mean, we in the budget will probably show the impact we have on sustainability. Even then, it's not enough to transform the economy without public and private partnerships. And sometimes, oftentimes, in terms of the domino effect, in terms of action by individual actors, our role is to be the catalyst for that change to happen. And then, in other words, the level of resource that will be needed in the future is significant enough that we understand we cannot do it alone.
Very good. Yeah, so it's going to need to be very collaborative in terms of advocacy, funding, and investment, not just by county government, but by virtually, all jurisdictions here locally, but also from state and federal level. And I think, let me further suggest, Craig, dovetailing off of your question, I think that we encourage you to continue to, I know you're a great advocate, I'm sure you do a lot, but encourage suggestions to county government and other government entities about, how they should shape their advocacy, at those levels, their policy platforms, what you would suggest to them, how they specifically craft that. So thank you very much for that. And then also too, forgive me, Mirza, you may have kind of spoken to this in your recent responses, but there was another question about, this is becoming quite a visionary effort here with RDF. It's intended to be collaborative, not just one government entity. But what are your thoughts about what can be done to make sure this isn't a plan that sits on the shelf? It's kind of a great process, but implementation got stalled. do you have initial thoughts or reactions about how the county and other entities will try and mitigate that and try and make sure the implementation can be real and tangible and generate outcomes? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's the key, Andy. The collaborative implementation is really where this framework has a unique place in our region. Our region, I've mentioned it a couple of times, has a lot of advantages, geopolitical advantages, the confluence of different actors around the table that we can get things done. So this, the intent here, and I think I saw a prior question, I think it was Adrian, someone that asked that, why don't we have the metrics yet? We're not, the County of San Diego, or for that matter, any other entity is not in the, it does not have the authority to mandate a particular course of action. We're coming to this, bringing what we can, and knowing that even with what we bring, we're not able to achieve our goals, so that we can set higher goals for ourselves. And when we add it up, we can be collectively responsible as a region, responsible to us and to our constituents, because many of our the board members that I have are shared with other regional agencies as well. So that is why there's not much of a passing of the buck here. It's a collective responsibility.
Right, absolutely. Thank you for that, Mirza. And I think on a relatively similar note, I think, Barry, if you don't mind, your question about implementing just in the county jurisdiction versus the entire region, I think what they're suggesting, I think Mirza's answer partially speaks to that as well, but I think there's also the acknowledgement that, you know, greenhouse gas emissions certainly work across jurisdiction. I know you know that, Barry, but I think you know they work across jurisdictional lines, and you know the changes we may make in one jurisdiction can have benefit or negative impact in another, and that there needs to be that collective effort, just as there needs to be, I'll say, collective effort across counties in our state and nationally, which I know many people here know and believe. So, but Mirza, did you want to share a little bit more, just reacting to that thought or question from Barry? Right.
So I'm trying to see what exactly what we're trying to do is additive to, in addition to the climate action plans that each municipality is expected, because of CEQA and other state law considerations, expected to adopt. What the framework is a path beyond that, knowing that what resources we have at our disposal within our own jurisdiction are limited in nature, and particularly where it comes down to regional, as I mentioned, economic development resources, they are regional in nature. Some of the businesses, some of the workforce, they don't end where the city's boundary ends. So people live in one city, work in another, travel to another city, they shop in another, recreate somewhere else. So that there is no boundaries for somebody that lives in San Diego region.
Thank you, Mirza. And I'm going to, Barry, you should be able to unmute yourself. He was just suggesting he could clarify. I probably twisted your question, Barry. So my apologies. You should be able to unmute. Go ahead, Barry. Yeah, let you clarify what you meant.
I completely understand, you guys, that pollution has no borders. Okay.
I know you know that.
and what I was referring to is from a county implementation standpoint, is a lot of times there are, let's just say, RFQs or contracts that are countywide. And the idea is there's not, let's be honest, there's not a share of effort or of passion if you don't really live in a community, right? I mean, it's hard if we have a large contract centered with someone in Oceanside and part of their area is in San Ysidro. I mean, there's organizations, I'm sure, in San Ysidro that can handle San Ysidro issues. The same thing about the central region, the same thing about the north region. So I'm thinking from a long standpoint of working with the county that something like that certainly will help the local economy. It will certainly provide more focus on that geographic area, and collectively, collaboratively, will we reach those targets. What's been happening is what I'm sitting here now talking about equity, right? What happens is in some communities, there is a disproportionate effort and a disproportionate results. So let us all handle our own neighborhood, so to speak. And that's going to mean a lot of CBOs have to get trained, because every CBO is not going to be qualified in those communities, but that type of thinking. So when I talk about breaking this thing up in small pieces, you know, it is certainly a collective effort, but I'm thinking the effort itself, the attention and the focus, if that were more locally, we might get better results.
Got it.
That's what I meant by that.
Thank you, Ray. Thank you for clarifying. I appreciate you coming on to do that. I don't
Just something to think about.
Absolutely. So think regionally, act locally, if I may. Yeah, it's kind of build, but in all seriousness, yeah, I mean, that's
excellent.
You're doing, I know you're doing great work in specific communities, as others are here too. So, you know, perhaps we can think about the playbook, for example, being very specific about, you know, strategies and plays, right, that are regional in nature, but also what can be done at a hyper-local level. For example, what are specific ideas and strategies that a local community, a neighborhood at that scale, we can offer and suggest, maybe urban neighborhoods versus a rural, you know, community village area. I'm thinking out loud, this is just me. But so Barry, thank you very much. We want to make sure we're thinking at all those levels, and then communities can work at the scale level that's most important and relevant, and focused on their, you know, the burdens they're dealing with and the benefits they can gain. So thank you very much. Really appreciate that input. I also wanted to acknowledge that there's a question about, in terms of key stakeholders and missions, the military. There's still very significant military operations assets, infrastructure in our region. And I think, thank you for those comments. We'll absolutely kind of think, as we think about these formation of these working groups, we can be proactive in ensuring that military leadership in our region are at the table and participating and contributing. So very much thank you for that. So I wanted to, again, highlight for you all, really appreciate there's been great, just thanks for the wealth of comments and ideas and questions coming forward here. Wanted to, just circling back, I know there's a couple other questions. I think, Jeff, you asked a question about, you know, if this will be kind of more of a living document when new technologies, strategies, ideas come forward in 2, 5, 10, 20 years, can and how will those be incorporated? I think the short answer is yes. I think I can speak on behalf of the project team saying absolutely, that we won't just kind of develop a playbook in the next year and say that's it for the next 10, 20, 30 years. It absolutely needs to be developed and refined and tracked over time. So thank you very much, because we want to make sure this will have to be an ongoing effort overall. So again, I want to encourage everybody, now is the time. If you have any additional comments or questions to bring forward that you want to share with the group. In the meantime, I want to acknowledge our colleagues behind the scenes have been taking diligent notes here of all your comments and questions on our digital whiteboard. I'm just kind of screen sharing that here briefly here, just to acknowledge a lot of great insight and comments here. We have it in the Zoom chat, we record and save that, but we're also kind of duplicating a little bit, making sure we have redundancy. A lot of great comments, again, ideas about the potential criteria for the playbook. We're getting notes down there. But the public participation process we've been talking about here, a lot of good insight on here. Thank you for all that. So I want to just acknowledge our team members that are doing that and making sure we get all of your comments and questions and ideas down in detail and at least a couple different places. So we've got a robust set of feedback from all of you. So thank you for that. Thanks again to our team members behind the scenes. So again, I want to go ahead and go so far as to say, kind of at this point, kind of a last call, if you will, for comments and questions that you want to make sure you leave with us tonight. In a few minutes, we're going to explain exactly how you can stay involved, reflect back on our upcoming next steps, some immediate dates that are coming up. And Petra, thank you. I see your fresh question here. Murtaza immediately responded, how can you participate in a working group? Murtaza noted there will be posting a form for those interested in participating in sectoral working groups on the RDF website. So I wanted to, and what I'll do actually to that end, let me show you. You'll see at the bottom of the screen here, and we will post these links in the chat just in the next 30 seconds or so. You see at the bottom of the website for the RDF, and sdcounty.ca.gov/RDF. Want to encourage you to mark that. Make sure you track that. Make sure you sign up for email updates if you're not already receiving them. You see now in the chat, there's an email address, there's a project webpage, and more about proposed sustainability actions that may be infused into the playbook coming forward. And Mirza will talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes related to next steps. So, to that end, I wanted to, briefly recap for you what those next steps are going to be. And you've seen this graphic now. The technical working group is being formed to inform the process. The social equity working group, again, working closely to engage with other social equity efforts that are already in process, to kind of connect with them, to make sure we have that equity lens applied consistently throughout this process and throughout all sectors. More public workshops, as you can see, anticipated for September, December, and January. The sectoral working groups that we've talked about, again, honing back in on those specific sectors of study, land use, electricity, and so forth. And then more regional convenings into 2023. Looking forward to that overall. So with that, I think what I want to do is we'll move into some closing remarks here. And Mirza, if you can speak a little bit more to what's noted, just recently posted, there's potential or proposed sustainability actions. And what I have on the screen here is basically a screenshot of what's on that web link. So you're all encouraged to go check that out. Can you speak to that a little bit more, Mirza, about next steps, and maybe talk about the board presentation that's coming up?
So thank you, Andy. On August 31st, tentatively, we plan to go to the board with an update on the decarbonization framework process for outreach, as well as our plan that I described today about the implementation playbook. At the same time as we're beginning this journey on implementation of decarbonization on a regional level, our departments within the county, including the General Services Department and the Planning Development Services and others, are thinking about how do we align the different activities that we do with decarbonization. So this is an initial list of 6 ideas that are going to be presented to the board on August 31st from our county departments to align with the regional decarbonization framework and to advance and support it in the implementation. The list here is the 6 proposed ideas are county facilities, for our county facilities, a zero carbon portfolio plan, an equity-driven tree planting program for unincorporated communities, a pilot carbon farming program, an energy resiliency and equity report, and an existing building electrification options report, and a hydrogen fuel station report. So these are ideas and suggestions for August 31st from our departments.
Very good. And before we talk more about that, actually, Mirza, can you clarify the social equity working group? Is that group formed? And can you just clarify? And it sounds like it has not yet been formed, right? How can people learn more about when and how that will be formed?
Yes, that is going to happen on a parallel track as the other working group. So it is the reason why we have it as separate is because it encompasses all the different pathways and will be providing input into the criteria that go into the different activities.
Great.
So that is why
and
it's going to happen at the same time.
Good. So if anyone has ideas about specific entities that you'd recommend to participate or at least reach out to for their input and ideas, please do. You see the email in the chat to the team, zerocarbon@sdcounty.ca.gov. I think that's another great way to give ideas and thoughts to the project team about what may be some approaches to consider for forming those working groups. So please do continue to share those ideas with the team. So I think with that, we're ready to bring it home. Again, I want to thank everybody just for myself and on behalf of the rest of the project team. A lot of great insight here tonight from all of you. I want to acknowledge the team for a lot of work gathering the presentation you saw today, and of course all the previous meetings and workshops we've had. This is an ongoing process. Thank you very much. I see the acknowledgement through the Zoom tools, but thank you. Yes, we appreciate that, and so acknowledging the team for all the work. A lot more work to come. Please do stay in touch through the links we provided and visiting the site. And again, knowing the board, we're targeting the date of August 31 on that board meeting day to provide them with a comprehensive update. You've got a pretty good preview of it here tonight. But I encourage you to stay in tune, attend that board meeting, share your thoughts as part of public comment. I know the board will appreciate that. The staff will appreciate you being there too. So with that, let me turn it back to Murtaza for some, I'll say thank you on behalf of the rest of the team, and Murtaza, final closing remarks, and we'll let everybody get back to their evening. And indeed, thank you to Giovanna behind the scenes, providing translation, interpretation. Murtaza.
Thank you very much. I won't take much of your time. I really appreciate all of you participating and coming today. And I look forward to as you're looking into participation into the regional convenings. And if you have time and interest, then please sign up for the sectoral working groups, which we'll be announcing in a week. All right. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Thank you all. Have a great night. We'll look forward to seeing you hopefully with the board on August 31st. But beyond that, a lot of more great opportunities. Stay in touch. Please keep sending those ideas in, and have a great night. We'll see you soon. Take care.